Need help falling asleep? This calming bedtime story, with rain for relaxation, is your nightly escape. Like, subscribe, and drift off with cozy stories for sleep. What's your favorite time of day to press play on videos like this? Now let's begin. The first time he called me by the wrong name, I didn't correct him. It wasn't even close to mine, Julian, he said, with quiet certainty, as he handed me a paperback I hadn't asked for, a weathered copy of The Invention of Solitude. You look like someone who reads slowly, he added, like it was the kindest compliment he could think of. I smiled awkwardly and nodded. Julian, why not? The shop was tucked between a tailor's and a locksmith, its sign half-faded, letters peeled by time, M. Dalka's Books. Inside, it smelled like dust, orange peels, and something almost like pipe tobacco, though I never saw him smoke. He stood behind a tall counter with chipped corners and a crooked lamp, sorting through piles that never seemed to move, but somehow always changed. He never asked what I was looking for. He just watched me enter, tilted his head, and after a beat too long, he'd say, "Ah, today, you're Julian." Or weeks later, "Welcome back, Clara." And each time, a different book would find its way into my hands. I never told him my real name, not once. It started as a game, one I thought he was playing alone. But after the third visit, I realized something strange. Each name felt oddly fitting, as if I wasn't being misnamed, but momentarily revealed. The day he called me Lena, he handed me a collection of Rainer Maria Rilke's letters. For when you need to feel brave and tired at the same time, he said. I hadn't said a word to him that morning. I'd barely slept the night before, wrestling with thoughts I couldn't put into shape. That book, those words, felt like someone placing a hand gently on the back of my neck. "Lena," he repeated softly, "you carry too many invisible things." I remember blinking slowly, unsure if I should laugh or sit down. This wasn't a bookshop in the usual sense. He didn't have a till, didn't accept cards. I once tried to leave money on the counter, and he just waved his hand and said, "Julian already paid." I didn't ask what he meant. Something told me not to. The space wasn't about buying. It was about being momentarily known in a way that didn't follow the usual rules. He didn't tell me who I should be. He just seemed to see who I almost was, or could be, or maybe already had been once. I began going there without needing a reason. On quiet afternoons, on wet Tuesdays, sometimes just to stand in the hush of that crooked little room where names were given like mirrors, not to reflect you, but to remind you you weren't invisible. And even though I never stayed long, I always left feeling slightly rearranged, not fixed, not understood, just softer. He looked up as I stepped inside and said, with no hesitation, "Theo." Not a question, a statement. His voice softer than usual, almost like he didn't want the word to echo too much. I froze. That name. I hadn't heard it out loud in years. It didn't belong to me, not exactly, but it once had. A version of me, long shelved, half forgotten. I used it briefly during university, a middle name I'd tested for about 9 months before abandoning it. Back then, I thought it sounded more interesting, more deliberate, like someone who reads poetry in train stations and orders espresso without sugar. but the version of me that lived with that name had disappeared quietly, folded into old notebooks and dusty playlists I never opened anymore. Hearing it now made something shift in my ribs. I didn't speak, just watched as he reached beneath the counter and placed a thin, square book in front of me. The Diary of Others by someone I'd never heard of. A slim, handmade-looking volume. He didn't explain, didn't describe it. Just tapped the cover lightly and said, "Don't skip the margins." Then went back to sorting a pile of books like nothing unusual had happened. I took the book, fingers brushing its uneven edge. As I walked back out into the cool morning air, I felt strangely exposed, not seen in a comforting way, but in a way that made you sit still and wonder what you'd been leaking without knowing. That evening, I opened the book on the kitchen table. It wasn't a story. It was a series of fragmented pages, observations, confessions, all in different voices. Each entry dated, unsigned, some crossed out violently, others written so faintly I had to squint. But the margins, that's where it lived. Scribbled along the edges were lines like, "I miss people who never knew me," or "Sometimes I lie awake and try to remember what my own laughter sounds like." One note just read, "You are not too late." And beside that, in tinier print, "But stop wasting time pretending not to care." My chest tightened. I turned the page, then another and another. I wasn't reading anymore. I was remembering, or maybe relearning. That book didn't feel written. It felt overheard, like someone had held a glass up to my inner life and transcribed the murmur. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from distress, but from something else. A kind of quiet buzzing, like I'd been nudged gently back into my own shape. I didn't go back to the shop for a week. I needed space to sit with the version of myself he'd touched, not because it hurt, but because it felt true in a way I hadn't expected. When I finally did return, he looked up as I entered, and for the first time he said nothing, just nodded. No name, no book, just presence. And I understood some names aren't to be repeated. Some are simply reminders that you've been paying attention to the wrong one. I started noticing how little I actually knew about him. Not just his name, I had long given up on finding that out, but the basics. Where he came from, how long the shop had been there, why the register never worked, why the lights were always slightly too dim, why he never wrote anything down, and why somehow he always knew what name to give me. I asked around the block. The tailor next door said, "Oh, the bookman? Been there since before I started. 15 years? Maybe more." The locksmith just shrugged. Never bought a key. Never asked for one. Neither of them knew his first name. One afternoon, I waited until no one else was around. Not that there was ever a crowd, and asked casually, "Has anyone ever told you you're a little mysterious?" He looked up from a book about birds and tilted his head slightly. "Only people who need too much certainty," he said. Then, as if to soften the edge, added, "You're not one of them. Not today." I laughed. But it wasn't really funny. It was more humbling. I realized how often I needed to define things in order to trust them. Relationships, emotions, myself. But here in this dusty, lopsided shop, nothing had a clear label. Not the sections, not the prices, not even me. And still, I kept coming back. The place had become a quiet sort of mirror, not the kind that shows you your reflection, but the kind that lets you sit near your own presence without rushing to explain it. The next time I entered, he called me Harper, a name I'd never been called in any life, any season, any half-baked reinvention. Harper, he said, handing me a battered notebook with no title, no author. Inside were pages and pages of questions, all handwritten, all in different ink. What would you tell your past self if they didn't believe you? Which memories do you replay out of comfort, not growth? Whose silence shaped you the most? I looked at him. Did you write this? He shook his head. No one did, or everyone did. That's the same, really. I took the notebook and left without speaking. That night, I read only 3 pages. Then, set it down, lit a candle, and just listened to the stillness in the room. It didn't give me answers. It gave me room. And slowly, I began to suspect that this was what he'd been offering all along. Not books, not names, just permission to pause, to wonder, to not be finished yet. Some days, I think about asking him directly, "Who are you, really?" But I never do, because I already know how he'd answer. He'd smile gently, tilt his head and say, "Not your question, Harper," and somehow that would be enough. I stepped in just after the bell rang, fingers still stiff from the wind outside. He looked up from his chair, a soft rhythm of dust dancing in the sunlight behind him, and said, "Elliot, the name didn't land. It didn't settle. It didn't wrap around me the way the others had. It hung there, hollow, like a coat meant for someone taller, thinner, someone with sharper edges and fewer doubts." "Elliot," he repeated, as if convincing himself. "You need something quiet today." But I didn't feel quiet. I felt off, a beat too far from my own skin. I took the book anyway. A slim, muted volume called The Weight of Still Things. I didn't ask what it was about. I just nodded and left, the name echoing behind me in a way that felt cold. That evening, I opened the book hoping for warmth, something familiar. Instead, the first line read, "Some days you will wear the wrong name for hours before you notice it isn't yours." I stared at that sentence, heart suddenly louder than before. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, a trick of narrative, but the page wouldn't let go. It continued, "You'll try to make it fit. Try to walk inside it like an old coat you've outgrown. But names, like memories, shrink when you lie to them." I closed the book, sat in the quiet, and wondered if he'd really gotten it wrong or if I had. Maybe I wasn't as certain as I thought. Maybe Elliot wasn't a mistake, but a name I'd been avoiding. A skin I didn't want to try on. I thought about who Elliot might be. Someone more composed, less curious, more guarded. Someone who didn't flinch at kindness. The truth is, it wasn't the name that unsettled me. It was how quickly I wanted to reject it, as if the discomfort itself was proof of something I didn't want to see. The next morning, I returned, the book in my bag. He looked up, expectant. But before he could speak, I said, "That name didn't fit." He nodded, slowly, not offended, just thoughtful. "It's okay," he said. "Some names aren't invitations, they're warnings. Sometimes I get them mixed up." I smiled, a little bitterly. "You ever tried just asking?" He laughed, light and brief. "If I did, you'd answer with who you think you are. And where's the wonder in that?" I stayed a while longer than usual that morning, didn't say much, didn't take a book, just stood in the presence of a man who may have gotten it wrong for the first time, or maybe gotten it exactly right, but not for now. And I left with no name that day, only silence. And somehow, that was the most accurate offering of all. The bell above the door gave its usual tired chime. I stepped in, brushing a few raindrops from my jacket, not expecting anything different, not hoping, not fearing, just arriving. He looked up, his fingers resting gently on the spine of a red cloth-bound book, and said, "Ah, you've arrived finally. Welcome, KL." KL. I blinked. The word didn't mean anything to me. It wasn't a name I'd ever been called. Not a middle name. Not a forgotten character from a story. It felt invented. Soft, but unfamiliar. I tilted my head, about to ask, but something in his face, in the precise calm with which he said it, stopped me. Instead, I said, "How do you spell that?" He smiled, not indulgently, but like someone who's waited a long time for something to unfold. "Cael," he said. "It's older than it sounds." He handed me a book with no cover, no title, no author, just a thick, heavy volume wrapped in a navy ribbon. "This one," he said gently, "isn't meant to be finished, just carried." I held it with both hands. The weight surprised me. It wasn't just the pages, it was something else, like the silence between conversations that mattered. "What does Kale mean?" I asked, almost whispering. He shrugged softly. "Not everything means something. Some things are something. The name's just waiting for you to grow into it." That night I didn't open the book. I placed it on the nightstand, still tied, like it might breathe if I left it alone. The name stayed with me, not nagging, not intrusive, but present, like a seed in the palm of my hand. KL. Not a version of me I'd been, not even one I understood, just possibility. And maybe that was the point. We spend so long believing we must return to ourselves, that who we were is the truest map of who we'll be. But what if we're allowed to become something we've never met before? What if we're not lost, just pre-arrived? The next day, I returned the book, unopened. He took it without question, placed it on a high shelf, and said, "KL doesn't need to rush. It's not a name for speed." I smiled. Will I ever grow into it? He looked up, eyes steady. "You already are. You just haven't noticed which parts." I left without another word, walking slowly through the gray hush of afternoon. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was collecting pieces of myself. I felt like I was learning how to let go of the ones that no longer fit. And that, maybe, was what becoming really looked like. Not building up, but releasing gently. Making room, not for answers, for arrival. He looked up as I entered, just as always. The bell above the door gave its usual reluctant sigh, and the warmth of the shop folded over my shoulders like a blanket pulled from memory. But this time, He didn't speak. No name, no sideways smile, no slow lean to reach beneath the counter, just silence. I stood there for a moment, half smiling, expecting the ritual to resume the soft ritual we'd built together across so many quiet visits. When nothing came, I cleared my throat gently. Still nothing. His gaze was calm, not cold, not distant, just patient. Like someone waiting for you to notice something that can't be said aloud. I stepped closer to the counter. "No name today?" I asked, trying to sound light. But something inside me already knew. He shook his head once gently. "Not from me." That was all. 3 words, "not from me." I let them hang there. They didn't feel like rejection. They felt like a doorway, a quiet invitation. He reached over and pulled out a small square of paper, blank, then placed it on the counter with a pencil beside it. "Just write it," he said. "Whatever it is today." My mouth went dry. "You want me to name myself?" He didn't nod, didn't push. Just let the moment stretch. I stared at the blank page. Funny how something so small can feel so large when it asks you to be honest. What name did I want today? Not my real one. That was too easy, too practiced. Not the ones he'd given me. They were gifts, mirrors, echoes. But this had to come from somewhere else. I picked up the pencil, held it, waited. Not for inspiration, for permission. And then slowly, in small, deliberate letters, I wrote, "Gray." I didn't know why. Maybe because it was raining outside. Maybe because I felt somewhere between versions. Not lost, not found, just held in between. I slid the paper toward him. He read it, looked up, and smiled, like someone who had been waiting for exactly that. He reached below the counter, not for a book, but for a key. Small, brass, smooth with age. He placed it in front of me. "Gray gets the back room," he said, "only for today." I blinked. "There's a back room?" He nodded once. "Only when the name fits." I took the key, unsure whether to laugh or run, but I didn't do either. I walked toward the back, where I'd never seen a door before. And now, somehow, there it was. And as I stepped through it, I understood something that has stayed with me ever since. There are names you inherit, names you're given, and then there are names you choose not because you want to be someone else, but because you're finally brave enough to be who you are now. The key turned with a gentle resistance, like it hadn't been used in years or had been waiting for the right set of fingers. The door creaked open to a room far smaller than I expected, not grand or hidden like some secret library, but simple. A single chair, a wooden table with uneven legs, one dim bulb hanging from the ceiling, swaying slightly as if the air inside had just exhaled. On the table, a notebook, worn, the kind with soft corners and a faint coffee ring on the front. Beside it, nothing. No note, no instructions, just the notebook, waiting. I sat slowly, the chair sighing beneath me, and opened to the first page. Across the top, written in slow, slanted letters, list of names that never fit. The first few were ordinary, ones I'd heard before: Thomas, Claire, Reed. Then it began to shift. Helper, because I didn't know how to say no. Quiet, because I thought being invisible was safer. Difficult, because I asked for what I needed. Too much. Not enough. Almost. I swallowed. Each word sat like a soft stone in my chest. I turned the page. The list went on. No explanation, just names. Names, not from birth certificates or mailboxes, but the ones to life carves into you when no one's listening. Savior, mistake, burden, plan B. I felt the room go still, like even the bulb was holding its breath. My fingers brushed over each one, like old scars you no longer hide but still remember how they formed. And then, near the end of the list, I saw one that stopped me. Gray. My throat tightened. No date, no context. Just the name, written in smaller, lighter strokes, as if whoever wrote it wasn't sure whether to include it, or maybe had only just begun to claim it. I didn't cry, but something in me stilled, not in grief, in recognition. This notebook, this strange, quiet record, wasn't about shame. It was about release, about naming what never belonged so you could make space for what finally might. I sat there longer than I meant to. No clock, no sound but the low buzz of the light, and my own breath, steady now. I closed the notebook, left it where I found it. Didn't write anything inside. It didn't need more names. It had already told mine back to me. On the way out, I noticed a small mirror on the wall, cracked in one corner, smudged with time. I looked into it, not searching for myself, just meeting the face that had finally stopped needing to explain anything. The door clicked behind me as I left. Not a goodbye, just a closing. And when I stepped back into the front of the shop, he was gone. The counter empty, the room unchanged, except that somehow everything now felt full. Months passed before I returned. Seasons had shifted. The kind of passing time you don't mark with calendars, but with how the light feels in the early morning, thinner now, or maybe just quieter. I hadn't meant to stay away that long. But sometimes, when a place gives you exactly what you need, going back feels like asking for too much. Still, on a soft Thursday morning, with clouds resting low over the rooftops, I turned the familiar corner. The shop was there, same faded sign, same tilted door. But inside, everything was different. The shelves were straighter. The clutter had been cleared. The warm scent of dust and orange peel replaced by something sharper, cleaner. And behind the counter stood someone new, younger, early 20s, maybe. Polite smile, nervous hands. He looked up and said, "Morning?" That was it. No name, no hesitation. Just ordinary. I stepped inside slowly, expecting to feel disappointed. But I didn't. I just felt aware of absence, and how sometimes it's the gentlest kind of presence. I wandered the shop for a while, fingers brushing unfamiliar spines, each book now with a proper price tag, a category, a barcode. I wasn't sad, I wasn't anything, until I reached the counter again, ready to leave. That's when I saw it beneath the glass surface, where once lived scattered papers and old pens. A single piece of thick paper, typewritten in faded black ink. It read, "Use names gently. They bruise. No signature. No explanation. Just that." I stood still. Something deep in my chest rearranged itself quietly. The young man behind the counter noticed me looking. "Yeah," he said, tapping the glass. "That was already here when I started. I guess the last owner left it." I nodded slowly. "Do you know who that was?" He shook his head. "Never met him. No one really knows. We just called him M." I smiled. Of course. He hadn't left a name. He'd left a practice. A way of seeing, a space that never needed ownership to mean something. I turned to leave, and just as I reached the door, the boy called after me hesitantly. "Hey, sorry, but what's your name?" I paused, thought about it, then smiled over my shoulder. "Doesn't matter today." And I stepped into the street, carrying no name at all, just a softness I hadn't known I still had room for. And that, I suppose, was the real lesson. Names are temporary, but the way someone says yours or chooses not to can stay with you longer than the sound itself. Not because they got it right, but because they saw you before needing to.